Welcome to another episode of the Journeys of Not So Ordinary People podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Dr. Dave Peltz, and along with me is my esteemed colleague, as always, my sidekick, Dr. Joe Hamlett. How are you doing today, Dr. Joe?
I'm doing very well, and thanks for that introduction.
Thank you, thank you. We'd like to welcome all of our viewers and listeners to another episode of the Journeys of Not So Ordinary People podcast, your personal, professional, and career development podcast, where we talk about a variety of topics and subjects. And today we have with us Ms. Ange or Angela Ange Barnes. We'll go with Ange. How are you doing this morning, ma'am?
I am wonderful, and I'm excited to be on this podcast
Yeah,
today.
we're excited to have you.
Exactly. Excited to have
So
you.
excited. And before we get into today's topic, Ange, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I hail out of Cleveland, Ohio. I'm a consultant, so I travel around the country or have traveled around the country. I got into the consulting space for nonprofits 10 years ago, as a lot of people do. You kind of fall in it backwards. I didn't necessarily go to school for that. And this was after having spent 15 years in corporate America in sales promotions, sales, and marketing. So I went and got my MBA, and then afterwards I thought, oh, okay, this would be a great idea. Let's get into nonprofit consulting. So I was not prepared to understand the transition of corporate sales marketing lingo
Mhm.
versus nonprofit fundraising lingo. It is
Okay.
a You have to transition. It took me about 3 to 5 years actually through professional development. So I was working on a huge event that was coming to Cleveland that was run by a nonprofit that had asked me to sit on one of the chairs, and I became co-chair of one of the committees. And afterwards, it was a success. Afterwards, someone asked me, "Hey, can you do this for our headquarters?" It was an organization. There's national headquarters was in downtown Cleveland. And I said, you know, I don't do this. I'm a for-profit person. I really don't understand the nonprofit world. I don't even understand how you can run it, and how do you operate as a nonprofit like you're not making any money.
Right.
And they said, you'll pick it up. Just come on. And the bug bit me. So during that time, I had to form an LLC. So ADB Strategies came into existence as a
Nice.
result of just purely needing a way to create invoices and receive the money from it. And that's where it dawned on me during that time, along with working on the one off event, that I could use my superpowers for good to influence people, to make an organization or its programming appealing, and to partner with donors to drive and fuel the mission. After that, I've worked with organizations in the nonprofit space in human services, religious, arts and culture, and higher ed. And it has been a thrill, and I love it.
Awesome. That's awesome.
Thank
Very
you.
cool.
Thank you for that introduction and letting our viewers and listeners know a little bit about you. So, with that, we'll introduce today's topic, which is journey of boundaries. Specifically, Ange is going to talk about her journey of boundaries or journeys of boundaries. Depending on how pluralized you want to make that. Pluralized is a word. We just put it out there. So, with that, Ms. Ange, what are your thoughts about your journeys of boundaries or with boundaries?
So I was raised to be a good girl, and I was daddy's little girl for, I mean, decades. I didn't fall out of that probably until, uh, you know, 10 years before he passed. He made his final transition in 2018. And it was always stressed upon me to behave a certain way, act a certain way, which, looking back on it, actually was just really putting up with poor behavior.
Mm.
So I learned how to either get around something or just, buckle down and prepare for the storm of the tsunami of what was coming my way that I didn't necessarily want. You couple that with, the good girl syndrome, as is now being labeled, and on the firstborn syndrome, along with, as an African American woman, the challenges that I faced, I continuously found myself having the same challenges wherever I would go.
Mm.
So it got to a point where I ran out of excuses for blaming the organization or blaming the people around me. I had to take ownership, and after, just not even going below the surface, gentlemen, it was just a mere scratch. It was on me. It was a lack of boundaries.
Mm,
And
that's
it's really
powerful.
became amplified when I jumped into the nonprofit space, because the nonprofit space is very different. We look at the financials and donors versus customers, but the processes are the same, but boundary setting and the expectations around that are very different.
Interesting, interesting. So, how are some of the ways that you have identified and or overcome the obstacles of these boundaries?
Well, a lot of times I was trying to jump over them, and realizing I couldn't jump that high. So I'd
Mm,
fall continuously.
mm,
It was not having the best relationships with individuals. They would start off in with me playing the role of the good girl. Then I would become exhausted, and then the relationship would die.
mm,
So this was a constant this was my process. It wasn't a healthy process. Sometimes in the DEI space, we may call this from pet to threat.
Mhm.
Okay, so I all of a sudden had an opinion. I had a plan, but that was turned into, you want to do things your way. You're being difficult, because I introduced myself as the good girl.
mm. I'm going to interject for just a moment. For our viewers and listeners, could you just briefly elaborate on what the good girl syndrome is?
Sure, it's people pleasing,
Mm,
basically. It's being for men, it's different. And I don't like to comment on that because I am not a man. So
Mhm.
I someone else would have to become a subject matter expert in that space. But I'm a subject matter expert on being a good girl. So that's what I specialized in for years, up until 5 years ago, and maybe 4 years ago. Basically, it's you get caught up in the people pleasing cycle. So you go along with the most dominant person's opinion in the room, so that you feel that you don't experience any harm from them. You defend that person, you go along with their ideas, the ideas don't work, you start making excuses, then you eventually get blamed for whatever didn't work.
wow.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay.
Wow.
So as a people pleaser and as a good girl usually is around family, but then we take that into the workplace. And
Mm,
that's where we find ourselves trying to be the boss's good girl, our colleagues' good girl, leadership's good girl, when really they don't need us to be a good girl. They need us to guide them to raise money and to keep them out of illegal, unethical, or impossible territory. That's what they need us to do.
that's powerful. That's powerful. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
So, going back to some of the challenges you've encountered throughout your career, I'm sure there are many. Like we all face different challenges. So, can you tell us about some of the challenges that you've had to overcome?
Mhm. So I'm trying to think of which one would make a great story because there's so many.
Which one?
Uh, One of them, it all comes back to just people pleasing behavior. I was consulting with a wonderful organization here in Cleveland, Ohio, and I walked in the door as a people pleaser, but I quickly had to 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 change my behavior in order to become effective in an organization where leadership paid and volunteer. That's what they call the board, volunteer leadership. Uh, had Didn't understand their role in the fundraising process. And that is to be expected because they weren't recruited to fundraise.
Mm,
I call that the coffee and clap syndrome. Board members are recruited, they come and drink a cup of coffee, maybe they have a piece of coffee cake and they clap about the budget, or they boo about it and they leave. But they're not, when we recruit board members, sometimes it's from a feel good aspect, it's not from a do good aspect.
mm,
Mm.
So
Okay.
leadership also, paid leadership, was not really well versed in fundraising. So I took it upon myself to not only train them, but also raise the dollars. There was extreme opposition from a couple of board members in particular. And I was their interim for 3 years. And every time that organization re-signed my contract, I think that person wanted to kill me. But because I started forming boundaries. I started forming boundaries. And the organization, I believe, kept me on board, not only because we were raising money. I mean, the first year I started, they were in between $350,000 to $400,000 a year. When my final year, they're at 1.2 million.
Oh,
And
wow.
that's not a lot of money for big organizations, but for a small nonprofit, that's a lot of money.
Right. Yeah.
They were able to double their staff. They were able to, really put money into programming at a higher level, which made more of an impact in the communities they served. They earned seats at the table that they had not earned before with other various organizations and funding organizations and recognition. But that was because I put in boundaries. And that was a very difficult situations, because some of those boundaries were emergency boundaries. They weren't just boundaries I naturally had. They were boundaries that I put in place because it was either put that boundary in place or I was going to walk away. And that's what I call an emergency boundary.
Yeah. So when you talk about the boundaries, what types of boundaries are we talking about specifically?
So the interesting thing about boundaries is boundaries are generally accepted in America, but they're not generally practiced. So there's a lot written about boundaries, and I've researched this, and I've kind of come up with my own language around it, so it's easy for people to understand. I divide boundaries into a couple of different categories. Internal boundaries, external boundaries, and emergency boundaries.
Okay.
I'm going to start with the easiest, which is external boundaries. External boundaries are boundaries that we put in place that help us interact with individuals at a higher level. It expresses how we want to receive treatment. You may see somebody's email signature that says, I'm going to reply back to this email between the hours of 8 and 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. And within 12 or 24 hours. So that's a boundary that you see. Now everybody knows it, so they know what to expect from you. And that way you don't find yourself over explaining how you talk about how you reply to emails. Then there are emergency boundaries. Those are the ones we don't like, but sometimes are necessary. So I recently had to apply an emergency boundary, and let me tell you, it didn't feel good. It doesn't feel good. But that was because I hadn't created an external boundary. Okay. Then there's something that we have not talked about that I recently stumbled on, that I was like, a light bulb went off, above my head. Internal boundaries. So external boundaries put in boundaries so that you could engage with other individuals, other groups, other organizations. Emergency boundaries are put in place when someone has sometimes breached an imaginary boundary or one you didn't know you needed to set. And internal boundaries, basically, they protect you from your bad habits and your bad ways. Mm. So have you ever ran into somebody who overshared, talked too much, was a close talker, just in general, or they were having emotional outbursts that weren't helpful for the team or the family? That's a person who doesn't have any internal boundaries. But we're not taught to have internal boundaries. We're seen as either we were raised that way or we were not. What if you were not? Who do you turn to? So internal boundaries are put in place so that it helps you. That's why people, you see people do their New Year's Eve goals. They're trying to put in boundaries about how their physical boundaries, their emotional boundaries, their mental boundaries, right? And those are probably the hardest. Emergency boundaries feel the worst. External boundaries are expected. Internal boundaries are the hardest.
That's powerful. Very, very powerful. Thank you
Wow.
for that. Joe, looks like you have some questions or thoughts or ideas.
No, I'm just even from the very beginning, thinking about, well, you start off with the good girl syndrome, and I really, I can relate to a degree because again, I'm the oldest child, the oldest grandchild, so that's
Oh,
been, yeah, so that's been a
double
lot.
whammy.
Yeah, that's been a lot of my life is to try and please other people, and so I can relate to that, and that does translate into the workplace, into the people you are close to, the organizations, just all of that. And that
All
is
of
the
that.
way you lead typically is, wanting to take care of people. So you're right. A lot of boundaries get crossed or they don't exist because you are always in that people pleasing mode. You're
Mhm.
always trying to, make the situation better. And
Right.
and a lot of times that's at the detriment of you, your
Yeah.
growth, who you
Yes.
are, who you can be. So
Yes.
it was just very interesting to hear that there is a syndrome for that for women, and I would imagine it's the same for men or something very similar. But I just from the very beginning that really caught me. But then the idea of the internal boundaries, you say either you're kind of born with or grown up with those or some kind of way, but I believe the challenge is because you said it too, you don't know you need boundaries. So think that is, the challenge for all of us to determine, our internal boundaries. Because, like you said, you get to the point where you don't want to be that fixer, you don't want to be the people pleaser, and then you come off as you're this, you're that, because you're no
Uh-huh.
longer playing, along with everybody else. But the realization is that you realize I need to set these boundaries, and now you're viewed differently. And so think that's what I've struggled with. I've gone this long in my life
Mhm.
with that people pleasing mentality, and now I've changed that, and it's not received the same way. So,
No, no. Dr. Joe, you've had loose boundaries all, your life, and now you've tightened them up and people are, it's almost like hitting a glass wall. You know how you ever
exactly.
walk
Absolutely.
into an office and have all glass walls and you didn't know where the door was and
Right.
that's
Yep.
what happened.
Yep.
I've left many forehead impressions on that glass.
You said something, I'm trying to remember what it was, Dr. Joe, that really made a lot of sense that I talk about in the program I'm crafting. It's let's see, you talked about people pleasing and the syndromes. Um, it'll come to me, but that's a great story to hear and to share. I have a incredible mentor who in the nonprofit space who's worked at some legacy institutions that would blow your mind. And this individual said to me, I wish I had knew about boundaries with my first leadership position. It would have saved me a lot of time. So a lot of us are learning about boundaries a couple different ways. If you're in a leadership position, your organization will pay for it, executive coaching.
Mm. Yep.
When you think about it, executive coaching, they're
Yeah.
putting in boundary. Or you are like me and you keep hitting your head up against a wall or running into a brick wall. And out of frustration, you start researching, you figure out that, you are the problem. You don't have any boundaries, which is the good news because you can change. You're not looking for other people to change.
Right.
Or third, your family members taught you about how to have boundaries. They instilled that. Your relationship was not predicated on not having boundaries because your parents' existence was not um, the platform of your parents' existence was not because you were a good person. It's because they knew how to manage you.
Right. Yeah.
So being the firstborn and being the first grandchild, oh, that was it. Taking care of everybody, being the fixer.
Yeah.
That's, it's everywhere. It's
Yeah.
it's it's rampant. Especially as women, we swear we can fix him or her. It's like I'm not. I'm listen. I'm not rebuilding this whole house.
Right.
I am not Bob the Builder. And I did that for years in friendships.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Romantic life. It's just like the people pleaser. And then when you need something, it's like the audacity. So
Right. Yep.
that's where you wake up and you're like, maybe this wasn't the best idea. But then we blame the other person. We blame the
Yep.
relationship. We blame the state of society when really it's internal.
Yeah, it's about our decisions to what we're going to accept and not accept.
Yep.
Mhm.
And you said something, the glass wall, that really resonated with me because in so many of the positions I've had throughout my career, in my military career,
Mm.
um, early on, I was basically groomed and taught how to be an overachiever. So that fixer, if you will, the
Mhm.
resolver, the one that's going to take us to the next level. And,
Mhm.
I took a lot of pride in that, and sometimes there was a long learning curve before I could actually get to that level. And other times it was very quick. But what I just realized with you saying that glass wall metaphor, it's as long as you're that overachiever and taking on all that extra work, getting paid the same amount, the moment that you push back
Yep.
with an idea or a solution that does not match what they want, air quotes they, all of a
It's
sudden you're the
over.
problem.
Yep.
You become the
Yep.
biggest problem. And so, that little epiphany right there, you know, just really kind of resonated with me because what it's starting to make me think, what could I have done differently to set those boundaries? Maybe not take on as much, maybe not be so hard charging and fast. Joe and I have both experienced, we've worked ourselves out of positions a few times in our careers where we've been so hard charging and get the high speed low drag, the problem solvers, the fixers, that we come in and we knock it out of the park, and they're like, yeah, thanks, see you later. And it's like, wait a second.
Well, and you may have experienced in the military. Don't get sick. Do
Mhm.
not become exhausted.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yep. Yep.
Oh, and never become frustrated.
Yep.
If you do, keep it to yourself.
Right. Yep.
Now, the person beside you may have boundaries and becomes frustrated. People's ears perk up. Leadership takes notice. But when the people pleasers becomes exhausted or frustrated or overwhelmed, overloaded, you signed up for that.
Right. Yep.
So
Absolutely.
we have the ability to control the perceptions about ourselves, about what we will receive, what we will not receive, our personal space. We control that. And that took me the longest. That took a lot of hard knocks to
Mhm.
figure that out, to the point where I'm very clear, I'm very conscious, and I'm very vocal in a graceful, professional way of my
We
expectation.
need a lot more of that.
And Dr. Joe, this is what you were talking about, people getting angry.
Right. Yep.
Yep.
Dr. Dave and Dr. Joe, when we haven't set boundaries in a long time, they all look like emergency boundaries.
Mhm. Yep.
And people becoming angry, especially, as a people, if you have people pleasing behaviors and people pleasing mentality, it feels horrible. I don't even have an analogy for it. It just feels horrible. You feel it in the pit of your stomach. And it's something that a cliche cannot solve. The word no is a complete sentence. It's actually not. Not for if you want to preserve the relationship. It may be for a stranger, but not for a work relationship or a personal relationship, friendship. It's not. How we deliver no, and what are the other words in the sentence?
And that's where I was going to jump in there because you're right. No is
No, it's not.
very simple, but to the people pleaser, it's not that simple. It's no, but I can do this. but and so it does become a sentence. It does become other stuff. So then when you walk away, you're
Mhm.
like, I said no, but I didn't mean it. I
Mhm.
actually allowed for additional, so that you said it. Yeah, no is a simple word. It's a standalone, but we change the meaning of it when we're
We
trying to say
do.
no gracefully or not hurt,
Mhm.
step on anybody's toes, hurt their feelings. And so,
I do believe we still need grace in society, though, Dr. Joe.
yeah, I
Even
agree.
even with people who are not people pleasers, just a no. Is there anything else after that? Well, I don't owe you anything else. Mm-hmm. Okay. How does that build a relationship? In the nonprofit space, we are in the business of building relationships. So how does that build relationships? How does that build trust? How does that build empathy? And that's a cliche, and we cover that. I cover that in the program, that it's nice to lay down a cliche to try and solve someone's problems, but it doesn't necessarily solve their problem. No. Okay, well, especially for somebody who is a recovering people pleaser, I give a good quality no now.
RPP, recovering people pleaser.
Mhm. I give a good quality no, and I learned that years ago in sales and marketing. Thank you for thinking of me.
Mhm.
Um, I don't have the bandwidth at this time, but I can give you the name of someone else who does. That sounds a lot better than no,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
no, we're not. See, that's the end of our relationship. We're good.
Wow.
All right, so we've got a couple minutes left. What are some of your final thoughts and nuggets that you'd like to give to our audience, our viewers and listeners? Because this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. This is one that I don't think Joe and I have actually ever had this conversation. I
No.
mean, not online, maybe offline, where there's steam coming out of our ears, but
These conversations are often had after a boundary's been breached, or the discovery that you need a boundary in place, so an emergency boundaries, or you just keep talking about the same thing over and over and over again, which I've done. I've been working on a boundary setting and boundary support program along with a book. And when I set an emergency boundary, the one thing I've noticed is it's not that the boundary is not needed, gentlemen. It's that I don't have the support I need to stay in it.
Hmm.
So therefore, I pop out of the boundary and I run away and I go back to my old ways. So the boundary setting program and boundary support group is a two-pronged process. First, boundary setting, we learn how to set boundaries. And then boundary support, once you start setting those boundaries, provide the support you need to stay in them. And it's incredibly important. I like I said, I recently set an emergency boundary, and I wanted to pop out of that every 5 seconds. It felt um, like hot pokers on my skin.
Wow.
And it wasn't that deep of a relationship. It was, I'm not used to doing that because I've had to go over my life and figure out where I need a boundary. And I missed a couple. Okay. And you're never above having this, you're never above running into an emergency boundary. You're just, you're just not. And the response I've gotten to just talking through this, so I've been presenting about boundaries. I think my first presentation was in May of this year. And it was well received. And it wasn't, I'm not popular. I don't have this huge LinkedIn presence. It's simply because I was talking about something that kept people up at night,
Right.
and people come to the presentations because I've done about 4 or 5 since. One was last week to a national organization, but they walk in the door wanting to know how I can, um, what is it? Teach me how to say no. I don't do that. It's teach you the fundamentals so that you instinctively know when, how, and where to say no. But just teaching you how to say no, there's a lot of digging in there. We gotta root around and figure out why, and then Also, there's a huge level of accountability. So you've heard me talk how I held myself accountable. It wasn't everybody
Right.
else's fault. It was my fault. How do I clean this up? So to leave your listeners with the nuggets of truth is you're not alone in this. We live in a country where boundaries are accepted, but not applied in the numbers that we think they are. And that it is okay to reach out and talk to someone about that. And that the boundary program will probably be up and running first or second quarter of 2025.
Nice.
And the book hopefully will be out by then so people can read about boundaries, but I would encourage them to start researching and really look into how they can start setting their own boundaries before it becomes an emergency, especially in the nonprofit space. Professional development is an incredible way to figure out your boundaries because it'll help you stay out of IUI, illegal, unethical, or impossible situations.
That's
Wow.
awesome. Thank you for that, Ms. Ange. Dr. Joe, any final thoughts?
This is most time I try and jump in there as much as I can, but this is just I've been absorbing all of this because again, right from the very beginning, this spoke to me, and then like Dave said, some of the things, the glass running into the door. So a lot of these things that I think I've needed over the years. So too bad I didn't have this conversation 10, 15 years ago because
Right.
again, I've faced a lot of these things you're talking about and just um, and you're right. We all of us struggle with this to some degree. So thanks for everything you provided so far. So I'm anxious to see the book and um, actually have you back on and talk a little bit more about it.
I'd be happy
When
to.
you get your program gets going, we'd love to have you back. So it's just been a pleasure having you on the podcast, and again, opening my eyes to some other things that I can work on in my journey. So thanks for that.
That's wonderful, Dr. Joe. Thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
I'd like to second what everything Joe just said. I'm not going to elaborate on it. We just want to thank you for your candor and sharing your journey and boundaries with boundaries. And yeah, it's such a great topic. We really appreciate you sharing it with us. And again, as Joe mentioned, we're looking forward to having you back after the first of the year to get kind of that status update on your program and your book. To our viewers and listeners, if you want to reach out to Ms. Ange Barnes, her LinkedIn profile is in the description. Her consulting information will be there as well too. So to all of our viewers and listeners, thank you for watching another episode of the Journeys of Not So Ordinary People podcast, your personal, professional, and career development podcast. And until next time, we want you to keep on being your not so ordinary you.